Today's session is Pilot Your Fermentation with New Yeast Nutrition Technology. We're fortunate to have Etienne Dorignac from Fermentis as our presenter today. A quick run through Etienne's CV highlights how qualified he is to present on this topic. After completing a master's degree in chemical engineering with a specialty in biochemistry, Etienne gained experience in food science throughout Europe before returning to France to complete his enology qualification. Etienne quickly gained experience in winemaking and worked as a consulting winemaker throughout France until joining Fermentis in 2007 as a product manager for the wine business. In Etienne's current role with Fermentis, he oversees the development and the application of all wine yeast and yeast derivatives, whilst ensuring that these products meet quality and regulatory standards. My name is Brendan Evans and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a non-practicing winemaker with a passion for things that makes us tick. I'm based in Margaret River, WA, and I currently head up the commercial operation of Fermentis in Australia and New Zealand for Portavin. So for those of you who are not familiar with Fermentis, it is the business unit of LaSalle, which was founded in France some 160 years ago, and is a leader in yeast and yeast products, servicing a multitude of industries across the globe. Fermentis was created in 2003 to lead the group through innovation in the field of beer, wine, spirits and fermented beverages. Its recognised know-how in the fermentation industry allows them to develop and produce specialty yeast products adapted to particular applications, manufactured in state-of-the-art facilities with individual production schemes for each strain. So just before I pass over to Etienne, today's webinar will be quite interactive, including polls, and I also encourage you to type questions in the section towards the bottom right hand of the corner as on the screen now. I'm just about to launch a poll now, so if I could ask everyone just to quickly fill this in and just to test the functionality of the polls. Fantastic. So there's just a couple more to vote. Great, thanks everyone. So I'll close that off now. Now, just while we're getting everything going, I'll just test the question functionality as well. Could everyone please just type into the question section the variety that they have the most trouble with in a typical year for fermentation. And while you're doing that, I'll just throw over to Etienne. Etienne, how are you going?
I'm good. And you?
Great. I know it's late in France, so
yeah, quite late here. So actually, hello everybody. That's how it looks like Etienne Dorignac. Actually, quite late in the evening, but actually that's I'm still fine about that. So,
right, so
yeah, Brendan, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to ask how if in France there are any particular varieties that you found difficulties with fermentation. We've got a few coming through here. Shiraz seems to be a fairly typical one.
Yeah, actually in France we have a particular variety, but I think it's the same in Australia or in other parts of the world. We have actually the Chardonnay, because the Chardonnay is a quite tricky variety to ferment, because it's full of yeast available nitrogen actually, and most of the time is over 300 ppm or 400 ppm of yeast available nitrogen, and actually that's very difficult to ferment. So we will see here with the presentation that actually to manage and to pilot the fermentation for these kind of varieties that needs also a supply of, let's say, organic nitrogen and not only mineral nitrogen can save your life and save your fermentation in that case. So Chardonnay is very interesting to look at when difficult fermentation are concerned, actually.
Okay, thanks, Etienne. So I've just had a few more people turn up. So just to reiterate, if you could type questions into the bottom right section of the screen. Etienne's presentation will go for approximately 20-25 minutes, and then there'll be about 20 minutes at the end, and we'll run through all of the questions that we have. So There is a prize of a 12-litre jerry can of vinegar liquid for the best question, so keep them rolling in, and I'll throw over to you, Etienne. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Thanks for the intro. Actually, today we'll see how to manage and how to pilot the fermentation. So actually the basics is for good yeast efficiency, the main thing is to ensure a good alcoholic fermentation run. And to do that and to have a good yeast efficiency, actually you have to be careful about fundamental yeast needs for growth and survival, and among those you have oxygen for sure, but you have also all the nutrients, so lipids, vitamins, and available nitrogen. And this available nitrogen is divided in two parts: the organic available nitrogen, which is actually free amino acids or small peptides. You also have mineral nitrogen that is supplied by ammonium phosphate, ammonia, or other stuff. But the beauty of the yeast derivatives, actually we will talk about today, is actually that all the lipids, vitamins, and available organic nitrogen can be actually supplied via yeast derivatives. And then it's only a question on how to add these nutrients and at the right quantity at the right time. And that's actually the question to manage the alcoholic fermentation. So about the yeast derivatives, I don't know if you're really familiar about that, but actually everything starts with the active yeast. The active yeast, you already know that you have different yeast for different fermentation profile and different wine types. But as far as we are talking about the yeast derivatives, actually this active yeast, you start to degrade it and to inactivate it. And that's the first product you can do is with a thermal treatment, you can make an inactivated yeast. In this inactivated yeast, actually, you have this part is represented the soluble part. So it's a very small part of the product. It's around 20–30% soluble. And in that part, you obviously have the nutrients. So as far as we are talking about inactivated yeast, we are not really talking about yeast nutrients because you really have a small part of nutrients in it. It's rather interesting for characterization products. That means that actually, if you have an active yeast that is first rich in antioxidants, for example, you just inactivate the yeast or you kill the yeast and you actually keep the antioxidants, and you have an inactivated yeast rich in antioxidants. So the real interest of these kind of products is more the native compounds that are derived from the first yeast than actually the supply of yeast available nitrogen. If you really want to supply yeast available nitrogen, or actually yeast organic available nitrogen, you have to degrade the yeast in a further way via the autolysis process. The autolysis is really the self-destroying of the yeast, and in that case you really see that the own enzymes of the yeast start to degrade the intracellular content and release a lot of soluble part. And in this soluble part is actually full of free amino acids and small peptides that are yeast organic nutrients. So that's actually our spring ferm. That is quite nutritive, and if you can go further to the process, you can actually make what we call the fully or total autolyzed yeast, which is actually divided into two parts, because all the intracellular content was solubilized, so you have very big content here solubilized with full of amino acids and small peptides, and you have remaining a non-soluble part, and this insoluble part is actually what we call the yeast hulls. And this yeast hulls and this yeast extract have actually both different actions. The spring cell, in our case, is the pure yeast hulls, is a purely detoxifier because the yeast hulls act like a sponge towards toxins during the fermentation, and we will see the importance to add yeast hulls in the fermentation. The yeast extract or yeast derivative is actually mainly full of available nutrients. So that's actually all represents the yeast derivatives concept and what are the best parts to use during the fermentation. if you compare the composition of these yeast derivatives in terms of mineral nitrogen, vitamins, survival factors, or detoxification profile, and organic available nitrogen, actually is very simple. You see that all the yeast derivatives doesn't have any mineral nitrogen, or very few, because that's all organic and only derived from yeast. And then the main difference are actually coming from an inactivated yeast to a partially utilized yeast to a fully utilized yeast, and then to the two parts of a fully utilized yeast that are actually the yeast extract from one side, the soluble side, and the yeast house on the other side. What you really see actually is the vitamins survival factors content are decreasing from an inactivated yeast to yeast extract. As far as yeast health is concerned, it's also decreasing till the yeast extract. The yeast extract is only the soluble part, so it doesn't have any yeast health. The yeast health pure have a full capacity of detoxification. But what of the interest of these yeast derivatives is from an inactivated yeast to a yeast extract, you increase drastically the organic available nitrogen. In terms of solubility, it's very obvious. Actually, you increase the solubility till the yeast extract that is 100% soluble, and the yeast house is less than 10% soluble, but have a lot of interest in the fermentation management, and we will see that. So actually, what's the main objective of and what the main benefits of the yeast derivatives is actually to ensure an efficient alcoholic fermentation to get the best from your yeast characteristics and capex. Actually, if you buy a selected yeast, you buy a yeast for a specific profile of this yeast, and if this yeast is not able to work very well during the alcoholic fermentation, actually you lose all the benefits. So we will see how to use the yeast derivative as fermentation activators and detoxifiers to ensure this efficient alcoholic fermentation. So I don't know if you're familiar with these kind of curves. That's actually really simple. You have first in dark, you have the density, so or the sugar decrease, the Brix decrease during the fermentation. Then you have in green the CO2 accumulation. So the yeast during the fermentation are releasing CO2. If you accumulate the CO2 and you measure it, you have the green curve. Then what is interesting is to see the fermentation speed, which is actually the red curve. The red curve, if you see, is actually the release of CO2 versus time. So it's really the fermentation speed. It starts with a lag phase, then during the growth phase you have an exponential increase of the speed of the fermentation, and you reach maximum here, a maximum speed, and then this maximum speed of fermentation is decreasing progressively because of what? Because of the ethanol inhibition, and then is stopping quite abruptly because of the yeast viability state, so because of the mortality of the yeast at the end of the fermentation. The beauty of this curve, of this red curve, is that actually it's interesting to correlate this curve with the yellow one. The yellow one is actually the yeast population. So the yeast population, we have a lag phase, then the growth of the yeast, an exponential growth phase, then a stationary phase that is actually only a fermentation phase, and the mortality time. So actually we have to look at three key moments to ensure a good alcoholic fermentation. First one is actually the beginning. At the yeast pitching, if you don't have a complete medium for successful growth of the yeast, you start with actually like a broken legs at the beginning. So you have really to complete the medium for successful growth of the yeast directly at the yeast pitching. Then when you reach the maximum speed, you see that it's completely correlated with the transfer from the exponential growth of the yeast to the stationary phase, so meaning to the growth phase, to the fermentation phase. And that's really important here to look at that. It's approximately happening at 1/4 of the alcoholic fermentation, 1/4 of the sugar consumed. And you see that at that time you have very important metabolic changes on the yeast, because actually, yes, you will go from a growing phase to a stationary phase. So you will start to, let's say, move from all the nutrients you put at the beginning of the fermentation will be for the growth of the yeast, will be used by the yeast to grow, and all the nutrients you will put afterwards will be used actually to ferment. And at that stage, because you have very big yeast population at that stage, this very big population needs a lot of oxygen to be healthy, and that's really crucial to add the oxygen at that time, so 1/4 of the fermentation. And then, as already said, you have since 1/3 of the output fermentation and then further, so between 1/3 and middle fermentation, you're in a stationary phase, so actually you will put nutrients, but these nutrients will not be used by the yeast to grow anymore, but will be used by the yeast actually to ferment. And that's really interesting to see the effect of different nutrients at that time. That's what I will show you. So if you actually take the yeast derivative part, the soluble part, the yeast extract part only, so full of amino acids and small peptides, what you see is actually this. So you remember we are here now in a real life, so you have lag phase, then you have the maximum speed of the fermentation, you decrease, and if you don't do anything, it's the blue curve. The blue curve is the test one. You don't add any nutrients during the fermentation. If at 1/3 of the fermentation you add a nutrient, you start a second increase of the fermentation speed. And if you really compare the dose of the yeast extract we put at that time and the maximum speed increase, you have a direct correlation actually between the dosage of the yeast derivative and actually the effect on the second maximum speed. So it's interesting to see that we have what we said, a constant efficiency. So the more you put nutrients at that time, the higher effect you will have. But it's not completely correlated to the yeast available nitrogen. Why? Because if you do the same with comparing diammonium phosphate and yeast extract at the same time of the fermentation and exactly at the same level of yeast available nitrogen, what you see is that there is actually a difference in the profile, in the activation profile. You have the DAP that is much more abrupt and sudden increase on the maximum speed, and you have the yeast extract that is the purple curve that is more, let's say, smoother action. So it means that even at the same yeast available nitrogen that you supply, there is a different impact between diammonium phosphate or yeast extract. And this means that you have a lot more things in the yeast extract that can explain that this has another impact on the fermentation and on the yeast at that particular time. And that's really something you see that on the same experiment, what we compared actually are the test. The test actually finished the fermentation at 1,100 hours, something like that. So without addition of anything. If you put the DAP at the necessary dose, actually, we finish in 900 hours. So we start to gain 20% versus the test one. But if you compare the addition of yeast derivatives, so the yeast extract at exactly the same dose of available nitrogen than actually the DAP, what you see is that you only need 500 hours to finish the fermentation. So meaning a gain of 55% towards the test. But meaning also actually that you reduce by twice actually the time compared to the DAP. So it means that yeast available nitrogen is a good thing because it's a good thing that you can measure easily, but it's not doing everything. That's why we call the yeast derivatives, we have a notion that is called the fermentative power, because this fermentative power is illustrated that yeast derivative is something else than only yeast available nitrogen. What is interesting to see is actually on the yeast house effect, as I told you first. So the yeast house effect, if you remember, the yeast house is let's say 100% insoluble, almost 100% insoluble. So it's not giving any nutrients to the yeast actually when it's fermented. But the effect is very interesting. So you have exactly the same experiment, but at 1/3 of the fermentation, in that case, you only put yeast health and not yeast available nitrogen through a yeast derivative or DAP. It's only yeast health supply in that case. So you see that only putting a yeast health part at that time, you start to increase the fermentation speed. So like another fermentation aid, even if it's a minimal effect. So that's interesting. You have an effect of the yeast house alone, either a support effect or maybe also a little bit of sterols that you add to the yeast. If you compare with the yeast extract or the yeast derivative alone, obviously it's a little bit less effect with only the yeast house. But if you combine both additions, there is really a synergy between yeast house and yeast extract. It's not something like 1 + 1 equal 2, is more like 1 + 1 equal 2.2 or 2.3, something like that. It's really a synergy. So that's really interesting to see that. And if you compare at the end of the fermentation, what are actually the interests of the yeast house, you can see that yeast house at the end of the alcoholic fermentation, so the red bar, actually was the only modality, the only condition to really finish the fermentation. Only yeast health, we finished at 8 grams per liter of residual sugar, so we were stuck. Only yeast extract or yeast derivative, we were stopping at 4.4, so still stuck. Only the addition of both, so the combination yeast derivative and spring cell, which is actually our yeast health, allowed us to finish the fermentation. So there is really an interest. If you combine that also with the oxygen at the maximum speed, as you already saw in my presentation, so if we put oxygen at the maximum fermentation speed, you enhance, let's say, the capacities, or you enhance the effect of the yeast health and the yeast derivatives. So if you compare at the end, in that case, you see that if you combine, so you start to finish the fermentation only with oxygen supplies and yeast derivatives, so you finish at 1.7 grams per liter of residual sugar. If you only put yeast derivative plus yeast health, you completely finish the fermentation. If you combine with oxygen addition at the beginning, so at the maximum speed, you really have the best finish. So that's really interesting to see the conclusions on the nutrient supply is that DAP alone, or let's say ammonium or mineral nitrogen alone, is not sufficient in all cases to secure the fermentation. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. And certain yeast derivatives, because it's not only yeast available nitrogen, have a fermentative power twice more important than actually here in that case the one of DAP. Then if you take this insoluble part, this insoluble part is also playing a role, have an important effect while no nitrogen is supplied. But it's not sufficient, it's nevertheless not sufficient to secure the fermentation. So actually, the combined supplies of yeast health, yeast derivatives, and oxygen at minimal doses are optimum to obtain fast and complete fermentation. That's really the main conclusions we wanted to have on the yeast nutrient supply. So that's the let's say the end of the first part of the not the fermentation, sorry, but of the presentation. And actually, we have another quick survey for you, quick poll for you. So over to you, Brandon, to activate the poll, please. So I don't hear you, Brandon, but that's okay. So the poll is actually with regard to additions at 1/3 of the fermentation, what best describes your winery practice? So first, only mineral nitrogen. So let's say when we say something about mineral nitrogen is ammonium, either mineral nitrogen plus organic nitrogen, so with the yeast derivatives, that's quite of complex yeast nutrient. And you also have organic nitrogen only, so yeast derivative only, or no additions at all. So I think you have something like 60 or 90 seconds to answer to that quick poll. Brandon, I still don't hear you. That's normal.
Okay, we're just closing it off now, Etienne.
Okay, perfect. So I can start the second part of the presentation.
Yeah.
Actually, yep. Thank you. So we were talking about what? We were talking about the importance of the yeast derivatives. So let's say of the yeast organic available nitrogen, but also about the yeast health effect. And what is the innovation we delivered now? It was 2 years ago, something like that. It's the viniliquid. The viniliquid is actually a liquid highly utilized yeast combining the effects of yeast derivatives and pure health. So you still remember these little drawings? Actually, that is actually a health and yeast derivative. If you take everything together and you don't separate anything, you have a fully yeast autolysate, and the innovation is that this fully utilized yeast was kept under liquid form for an easy-to-use product. First, why we did this kind of product? Because we could have the same efficiency with the dry equivalent product. So why we did that under liquid form? And what is interesting is to see, so you remember here the curve, so with the maximum speed here, and if you don't do anything, so meaning the test is the orange curve. If you don't do anything, you are here. What is interesting is that we compared in that particular experiment only the addition of oxygen at the maximum speed, or the addition of the oxygen at maximum speed, yeast health and yeast derivatives, so yeast extract at the 1/3 of the fermentation, but these yeast extract and yeast health were under dry form, and we compared the effect of the viniliquid compared to this dry product, the viniliquid, and actually we did exactly the same correspondence in terms of yeast available nitrogen supply and in terms of insoluble fraction supplied to be exactly the same, let's say, level of yeast health added either in a dry form or in a liquid form. And what we saw actually is, first, if you compare the addition of oxygen and viniliquid compared to the test, you finish the fermentation in 42%, let's say, earlier. If you compare with the oxygen, you get 31%. If you compare actually the viniliquid and the supply of the same nutrients but under a dry form, you still gain 10% of fermentation time in that case. So, meaning that it seems that because if it's liquid, we seems to have another effect. Either the effect is because it's already dissolved and immediately dissolved in the must, it's already immediately assimilated by the yeast, could be something. Another thing could be that because we kept this product under the liquid form, we don't dry this product, and if we don't dry this product, we keep quite a lot of vitamins and nutrients that can actually be removed by the drying. Anyway, we still see that the vinyl liquid, so a liquid form, is better and more efficient than a dry form. So you see that and with the residual sugars in that case. The interest is also actually to see the effect of the liquid form on the yeast population and on the yeast viability, because you see that here the purple curve, you have the yeast nutrient supply at that time, so vinyl liquid or the dry product at that time, and what you see actually is that you have a slight increase and remaining viability with the dry product, which are actually the orange curve, but you have a strong increase of the population, and you don't see here the viability, but it's the same in terms of viability remaining at the end. You have much more viability with the vinyl liquid. So it seems really that the liquid form is doing something else than the dry form. So the conclusions on vinyl liquid nutritive action, so on the efficiency of this product, are actually vinyl liquid is even more efficient than the dry product actually to achieve and secure the fermentation, and vinyl liquid leads to a more important cellular growth and viability maintenance. So if you remember, we were talking about not only yeast available nitrogen, but rather about fermentative power. And if we take that into account, we say that, let's say, a usual dose of the vinyl liquid, which is 50 milliliters per hectoliters, is supplying an equivalent yeast available nitrogen supply of 20 ppm. And that's really an equivalent. But this product is liquid. And this liquid is really what we call actually the easy-to-use product in our product portfolio. That is to see with products that we ease their use to simplify the way of working of the winemakers. And in that case, actually, it's liquid. So you have less volume to handle, and you have a total dispersibility into the must, without homogenization problem, because that's the beauty of the product. Even if you have two parts, yeast hulls and yeast derivative or yeast extract, actually these both products, even if the yeast hulls are completely insoluble, are not depositing, are not settling. And that's really interesting in that case. You don't have to shake the product before use. Then it's pumpable and homogeneous, and that's actually the packaging that looks like. You have a small packaging that is actually a 12 kilo jerry cans pack. So this is the one you have to win this morning. Actually, this is a 12 kilo jerry cans for manual use. But you can also have it on an industrial packaging, which is actually like a huge bag-in-box. And this huge bag-in-box can be actually linked to pumps, and these pumps are linked also to the tank. So you can either control manually the pump, or you can also control automatically the pump to add when you want and at the right dose the vinyl liquid during the fermentation. And this big packaging is actually somewhere sustainable. Why? Because it's a real bag-in-box. If you see this, you have the bag that contains the vinyl liquid after use, and then all the parts that were actually the envelope of the packaging, you can remove the plastic things, and you have a part that is completely recyclable, and this has to be thrown away because it was in contact with the product. And then, last but not least, actually the security. It's a liquid product, so actually it confers more security to the end user and eliminates the risk of inhalation related to highly dusty products. So I made a very funny experiment in that picture. You have the vinyl liquid on one side and the dry yeast derivative on the other side. So the equivalent, which is actually the spring firm extreme in our range. So you see that you have a little bit more volume actually with the vinyl liquid, which is normal. It's a liquid product, but not that much because the density of this product is much lower than the density of the dry product. But what was interesting when putting these both products in a glass tube is that you really see the dust here induced by the powdery product, and obviously you don't have it for the vinyl liquid. And that's interesting in terms of security in the cellar, security in the winery, because a lot of people or winemakers are using a lot of yeast derivatives or dusty products, and that could be not safe for them, and you avoid that with the vinyl liquid. So to conclude, and to conclude also this presentation, we set up a performant yeast utilizate under liquid form, which is called the vinyl liquid, and actually it helps you, why? To accelerate or to securize the alcoholic fermentation, because the idea, and we saw that in the previous experiments, is that either if the conditions are not really difficult, let's say, it's to shorten the fermentation time, can help to shorten the fermentation time if you better know how to manage the fermentation. But then in case of you have difficult conditions, it can really secure your alcoholic fermentation and not to be stuck at the end. Then you have an optimization and a simplification of the supply, why it's liquid, so and you can put it automatically or manually, and it's very easy to use, and a safe use. So it's really part of the products in our portfolio that we call easy-to-use product. That is a new concept within Fermentis range. So I really thank you all for your attention on this webinar this morning for you, and thank also Portavin to have invited me to do this and to present these topics to you. So now I think it's time for the question, and we will see how it's going on with Brandon.
Well, great. Thanks very much, Etienne. And we have had a few questions come through. Just while everyone's got a moment to think about things and get your questions in. Etienne, the first question that's come through was just a question about if someone was going to choose a trial variety or wine style, would you have any recommendations for the use of vinyl liquid?
Actually, what is interesting to use the yeast derivatives side is actually mainly for the white and rosé, actually, because for the white and rosé you have particular difficult conditions, normally because you can have a strong settling down at the beginning. And this strong clarification can remove quite a lot of, let's say, organic nutrients, not only yeast available nitrogen, but also lipids and also vitamins or other things. In that case, the use at the beginning of the fermentation directly at the yeast pitching of a yeast derivative can be very interesting as well, and to combine both, so at the beginning of the fermentation and then through the third or middle fermentation to ensure the fermentation phase. So white and rosé are particularly tricky to handle because of this clarification, actually. And that's why the first key moment, let's say, so the yeast pitching is very important to watch or to look at.
Great, thanks. Now there's another question. Etienne, is there a correlation of this research against the sensory qualities of the finished wine?
Yeah, so, that's a really good question, actually. We are still looking for the aromatic impact of the vinyl liquid. Obviously, if you secure the fermentation and if you put the yeast in a very easy conditions, this yeast will give actually its best. So you will release quite a lot of aromatic compounds, and the enzymatic activity of the yeast will be good. What we saw for the time being with the vinyl liquid The main impact, I should be honest to say that, is the main impact is actually on the mouth. The mouthfeel is very increasing. Let's say the fat mouthfeel is really increasing significantly when you use the vinyl liquid during the fermentation. And then we are still looking at the aromatic profile. So if it's enhanced somewhere the aromas, and we saw that actually on the let's say on the estery profile, it seems to be maybe not completely significant compared to the others, but start to show good trends on that because it's supplying a lot of amino acids. But we're still actually looking at that, and for sure the main significant effect we have for timing on the organoleptic profile is actually on the mouth and let's say the fatness that gives this product.
Great. Etienne, there's some more questions here about the shelf life of vinyl liquid once it's opened.
The shelf life of the vinyl liquid, actually, when it's not opened, is 2 years shelf life. When it's open, actually, it depends on the type of packaging, because you can obviously see that the 12 kilo jerry cans, if you start to use it, the first thing is at the end you have air in it, and actually you allow contamination to go in. And so most of the time we prefer using this, or we advise to use this product when open, so when the jerry can is open during 1 week, let's say 5-7 days. You keep it hermetically closed in a cool place when it's open, and you can use it during, let's say, 1 week or 2 weeks maximum. As far as the big bag-in box is concerned, actually it's like really a bag-in-box, so you don't have a lot of oxygen that is coming into the bag, and in that case you can use for let's say 2 weeks to 1 month without problems during the harvest. So.
All right, we're just about out of time, Etienne. And we're through with the questions that I have so far. So was there a question there you think possibly deserves to win the prize for today?
Yeah, actually the question, and that's true on the one of the aromatic profile, actually, because it's a really good question, and we are actually looking for that also internally, because it's quite new product, so we are sure now of the effects on the fermentation, let's say, securing, but we are still developing and studying the aromatic impact. So that was quite a good question, and I think it was not in my presentation. This could win actually the jerrycan, I think.
Great. Well, congratulations,
if you agree with me, yeah, because actually you will be the supplier of the vinyl liquid, so you have to agree with me.
Well, just before we sign off, everyone, thanks very much for joining us today, and thanks again to Etienne for his fantastic presentation. We're following up with the download link if you want to see this presentation again, and also there'll be some handouts followed up via email. So, yeah, thanks everyone, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. Thank you for organizing this.